Hello, welcome to another video on solving algorithms on HackerRank. So in this algorithm, you're going to find the diagonal difference of a matrix. Okay, so given the square matrix of size n by n, we are going to calculate the absolute difference between the sums of its diagonals. So we have an array, we have a sample matrix here, with the first row having 1, 2, 3, the second row of elements 4, 5, 6, the third row is 9, 8, 9. Okay, so we are supposed to find the diagonal difference. So how then do we get a diagonal? The diagonals are this: 1, 5, and 9, and then 3, 5, and 9. These are the diagonals. So we are supposed to find the difference or the sum of the diagonals first, then we find the difference between the two diagonals. So the first diagonal is going to be 1 plus 5 plus 9. The second diagonal is going to be 3 plus 5 plus 9. Okay, so giving us 15 minus 17, which is 2. In natural sense, without the absolute, you're supposed to get negative 2. That with the absolute, the answer, when the answer is negative, the absolute will make it positive. Okay, so the absolute makes a negative answer positive and a positive still positive. So 50 minus 17 in actual sense is supposed to give us negative 2, but because we are to apply the absolute method on it, we are supposed to get a positive answer, which is 2. So irregardless of the value we get, we are still going to get a positive answer. So that is one of the advantages of using the absolute here. Yes, so this is the issue we are supposed to solve. This is the problem we're supposed to solve. You're going to find the diagonal difference of the array. So now how do we have to do? We have a matrix, right? So the matrix is also some kind of an array. So let's say how we would perform or how we would manipulate the items in an array. We'll still do the same thing here in the matrix. Okay, so we'll write a loop which will take care of this particular array. So there will be a nested loop. A nested loop means having an outer loop and then an inner loop, or yes, so having an outer loop and then an inner loop. So we'll have an outer loop that will take care of, that will iterate through each of the rows, and then the inner loop will iterate through each of the elements in the smaller array. Okay, so we'll have one of the outer loop iterating through the rows and then the inner loop iterating through the elements. Okay, so yes, that's what we are going to do. So now suppose we have a function. So the name of our function is diagonal difference, right? So over here, this is how we are supposed to write our solution. So our function's name is diagonal difference, which is taking a parameter called ARR, which is array, right? It's taking an array as its parameter. So now how do we do? We said earlier that we are supposed to write a for loop, a nested loop, which would the first one to iterate through the rows and then the second one to iterate through the elements in the array. So now let's go ahead. So first thing I'll do here is to declare the length of the array. I'm doing it because we are having a nested loop, and then instead of you repeating array.length, it will be best, in order to save computational time, it will be best if you just declare the length and then we'll just have to call it instead of you saying the array.length and array.length. So let's start. So let's let our n to be equal to array.length. Right, now we write our nested loop. So for let I equal 0, I is less than the length of the array, which is n. Now I plus plus. Now we are going to write another for loop, which will take care of the element in the array, right? So for let j equals 0, j is less than the length of the array, j plus plus. So over here we can see that we have our nested loop here. We have the outer loop which will take care of the rows, and then we have our inner loop which will take care of the elements in the array, right? So now we've done this. How then do we go about calculating the diagonals? How do we even get to solve for the diagonal? So there'll be some conditions here, right? To get the first diagonal, let's look at this. To get the first diagonal, it means you're going to write something like this. So let's say to get the first value in an array, if we're working with normal arrays, to get the first value, we would have written something like this. Okay, if you write something like this will give us the first value in the array, which is going to be 1, right? So how then do we make sure, or how then do we let our for loop take care of this, right? So the first thing we're supposed to do is we are supposed to find the sum of the diagonals. So we have two different diagonals. 159, the sum is 1, and then we have 359, which is 2. So we have two different diagonals. Then we subtract the value. So now how then do we calculate the first diagonal, and then how then do we calculate the second diagonal? So let's look at this. So the first diagonal is pretty simple. How then we'll have, it's pretty simple because to solve this, all we have to do is, if the index of I is equal to the index of j, if the index of I is equal to the index of j, then all we have to do is to get the element at a particular index. That is it. So if I is equal to j, so over here the first index is this. The index of I is what? 0. The index of j is 0, and the value is 1. So we pick that value. So to get to the first diagonal is pretty simple. Now, however, how then do we solve for the second diagonal? How then do we solve about the second diagonal? Do we have any idea? Okay, let's see how we are going to do this. So now, looking at this particular array or this particular matrix, we would have realized something. Realize that to get the second diagonal, which is what? If we add up the indexes on the second diagonal for this 3 by 3 matrix, you're going to realize that we will always get a sum of 2. Right? The indexes, if this will be index 2, this is I, this is I, this is the first row, the second row, so I of index 2, and then j of index 2, right? So I of index 2, I of index 2, and then j of index 2, which is going to be 5. So we've realized that if we add up the indexes on the second diagonal in this particular matrix, we are going to get a sum of 2. Now the length of the matrix minus 1. Okay, so in order for this to work for any given array, any given matrix, whether it is a 3 by 3 matrix, a 4 by 4 matrix, or even a 10 by 10 matrix, in order to get the value of the second diagonal, we are going to add up the indexes of the second and the first and the second, which is give us 2, and then what? We also get the length of the matrix minus 1. Okay, so now let's see how best we can do this. So we said earlier that, so first, before we have to do it, we are supposed to declare the sum of the diagonal. So let's say we are going to let diagonal 1, we are going to initialize it to 0. Also, we are going to let diagonal 2, we initialize it to 0. So this diagonal 1 is this. We are taking the first, so we are summing the diagonals 157. The diagonal 2 is going to be this 359. Yes. So that is what the diagonal 1 and 2 means. Okay, so here what we are going to do is, we said earlier that in order to get the first diagonal, which is this, there's a condition that if the index of I is equal to the index of j, then I'm going to pick the element that is there, right? So if I is equal to j, then our diagonal 1 will be equal to, so we are picking that value at that particular index. Okay, we are picking the value at that particular index. Okay, now how then do we get the second argument, the second diagonal? We said that if we add up I and j, we said if we add up I and j, and then we get to the length, so it's supposed to be equal to the length of the array minus 1, or the length of the matrix, sorry, the length of the matrix minus 1. So we do this, and then we also calculate the value for the second array. So it's almost like you're writing diagonal 2. Instead of you writing diagonal 2 equals diagonal 2 plus the index, that is why we use the short form, and then just go ahead and write diagonal 2 plus or equal to this. So this particular if statement is going to handle the first diagonal, and then the second if statement is going to handle the second diagonal. Now, after getting these two values, what then do? We are supposed to find the absolute value. So when we calculate the difference, right? So we're going to return diagonal 1 minus diagonal 2, right? This is what we are supposed to get, but we said earlier that the value might be negative, the value might be positive, but we were asked to find the absolute. So how then do you find the absolute of this? So we're going to cut this one and then call the predefined math function in JavaScript. It has a method called apps. Okay, this apps value returns the absolute value of a number. So the number without regard to the value without regard to whether it is positive or negative. For example, the absolute value of -5 is the same as the absolute value of 5. So it means if your value turns out to be a negative, because of this absolute method we are applying to it, we are going to get a positive answer. Same as if it is a positive answer, it is going to be a positive answer. So this absolute method will handle that condition for us. Okay, so that is it. Let's run it and then see what we get. Okay, so it worked. So all what we did was this. We had to declare the length of the array in order to reduce computational time. We also had to initialize these two diagonals, which will sum up the elements at that particular index. Okay, so now we had a nested loop. The first for loop took care of the rows in the matrix, and then the second for loop will take care of the elements, each of the elements at a particular index. Now we had two conditions. We said that if the index of I is equal to the index of j, we calculate or we pick that value at that particular index and then we sum it up. Okay, and then also if we sum up the first, we said in order to get to the second diagonal, we're supposed to sum up the first and the second. We're supposed to sum up the index I and j, the value at index I and j, and then equate it to n-1. And then we do what? We find the diagonal 2. Then we return the absolute value of the differences 1 and then 2. So that is it. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.